Imagine a small group of islands lashed by storms at the edge of Europe. Their jagged cliffs face the Atlantic, their rivers cut deep into fertile valleys, and their people, wave after wave of settlers, invaders, dreamers, and conquerors, have shaped not only their own destiny, but the history of the entire world. This is the story of the United Kingdom, an empire that once painted the globe red, a monarchy that has endured for over 1,000 years, and a nation whose culture, language, and ideas resonate in every corner of the earth. But the tale of Britain is not one of easy triumph. It is a history written in battles and betrayals, in kings crowned and kings executed, in revolutions both political and industrial, and in the struggles of ordinary men and women to define their identity. Celts, Romans, Saxons, Vikings, Normans. Each wave of conquest left scars and gifts, weaving together the fabric of a kingdom that would one day dominate the seas, forge an empire, and yet, in modern times, wrestle with its own unity. From Stonehenge to Shakespeare, from Magna Carta to the Blitz, from the rise of Parliament to the fall of empire, Britain's history is a journey through the birth of democracy, the explosion of industry, and the enduring clash between tradition and change. This is not just the history of a nation, it is the story of how a set of islands, often divided, managed to forge one of the most influential powers in human history. Let us begin at the dawn of its story. Before the flags, before the crowns, before even the idea of a kingdom, the British Isles were a wilderness of forests, mountains, and scattered tribal settlements. The earliest peoples to leave their mark were the Neolithic builders, whose great stone monuments, Stonehenge most famously, still rise from the landscape like silent witnesses to a world lost to time. These people farmed the land, built ritual centers, and worshipped the cycles of sun and stone. By the first millennium BCE, a new people had arrived, the Celts. Fierce, warlike, and deeply spiritual, the Celts organized themselves into tribes, each with its own chieftain and druid priests. They spoke languages that are the ancestors of modern Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, and Irish. Their culture left behind intricate metalwork, hill forts, and myths that still echo in Arthurian legends. Yet despite their courage, the Celts were not destined to remain masters of the islands. In 43 CE, everything changed. The legions of Rome under Emperor Claudius marched across the Channel. With iron discipline and unmatched military engineering, they carved roads, built fortresses, and imposed their rule. The Romans founded Londinium, modern London, as a bustling trade hub. They introduced baths, aqueducts, and written law, binding the island closer to the empire. But conquest was never total. In the north, the unconquered tribes of Caledonia, modern Scotland, resisted fiercely. So fierce was their defiance that Emperor Hadrian ordered a wall built across northern Britain to keep them out. Hadrian S. Wall, a lasting symbol of Rome's fragile control. The Roman centuries brought both prosperity and upheaval. Christianity began to spread, carried by missionaries. Native Britons learned Latin, some serving in Rome's armies abroad. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. In 60 CE, the warrior queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe led a rebellion so ferocious that it burned London to the ground before Rome crushed it. By the early 5th century, Rome itself was crumbling. In 410 CE, the legions were recalled to defend the imperial heartland. The Romans left, but their roads, cities, and faith remained. Into the vacuum poured new peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from across the North Sea, ushering in a new, turbulent age. The legacy of this era is profound. The Celts gave Britain its first enduring cultural identity, rooted in myth and song. The Romans gave it law, infrastructure, and the first taste of centralized government. Out of this collision of native and foreign, pagan and Christian, would emerge the foundation of the English kingdoms that followed. The ancient past of Britain is not just prologue, it is the soil in which all later history is rooted. The clash of cultures, the resilience of its people, and the tension between unity and division are themes that will repeat across centuries. From the fires of rebellion to the stones of empire, Britain was already becoming a land where history itself was forged. When the legions of Rome departed in the early 5th century, the island of Britain stood vulnerable. Its towns still bore Roman walls, its fields Roman farms, its people some remnants of Roman law, but there was no longer an empire to protect them. What followed was chaos, and into that chaos came new waves of settlers. These were the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, seafaring peoples from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. They did not arrive as a single invasion, but rather as tribes and clans, drifting across the North Sea in long wooden ships. Some came as mercenaries invited to defend local rulers, others as raiders seeking new land, and still others as settlers fleeing turmoil at home. By the 6th century, their presence had transformed the island. They pushed the native Britons westward into the rugged mountains of Wales and Cornwall, while their own communities spread across the fertile lowlands. From these settlers came the first outlines of England itself, Engleland, the land of the Angles. They brought their language, Old English, which would one day evolve into the English tongue spoken across the globe. They built wooden halls for their kings, carved runes into stones, and worshipped gods such as Woden and Thor. Their poetry, preserved in epic works like Beowulf, sang of monsters, heroes, and the fragile bonds of loyalty in a harsh world. Yet even as these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex and others, grew in strength, they were rarely united. Rivalries, shifting alliances and bloody feuds marked their age. For centuries, the dream of one England remained elusive. Still the Anglo-Saxons laid down enduring roots. Local assemblies, known as moots, codes of law, and the beginnings of a Christian church that would grow in influence after the missionary work of St. Augustine of Canterbury in the year 597. But just as the Anglo-Saxons had arrived in the wake of Rome's fall, so too would they face a new and even fiercer wave of invaders. In the late 8th century, the horizon darkened with the sails of the Vikings. The first recorded raid struck in 793 CE, when Norse warriors descended on the monastery of Lindisfarne. The slaughter was shocking. Monks were killed, treasures looted, holy books burned. To Christian chroniclers, it was a vision of the apocalypse. The heathen men came and miserably destroyed Goddess Church. But it was only the beginning. For 2 centuries, Viking longships swept along Britain's coasts and rivers, striking towns, monasteries and trade centres with terrifying speed. At first, these were raids, swift and brutal. But soon, the Vikings came to stay. They seized land, built settlements, and established a territory known as the Danelaw, stretching across much of northern and eastern England. Towns like York became powerful Norse strongholds, their streets echoing with Old Norse alongside Old English. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fractured and divided, faced disaster. It seemed the island might fall entirely under Viking rule. But out of this crucible of crisis arose one of England's most legendary figures, King Alfred the Great of Wessex. Alfred, who ruled from 871 to 899, was not merely a warrior, but a statesman and scholar. He reorganized his armies, built fortified towns known as burhs, and developed a system of rapid defense against Viking incursions. Most crucially, Alfred saw himself not just as the King of Wessex, but as the defender of all the English. Through a combination of resilience in battle and shrewd treaties, he preserved a core of Anglo-Saxon independence in the south and west, laying the foundations for future unity. Alfred also understood that power was not won only on the battlefield. He sponsored the translation of Latin texts into Old English, fostered learning, and cast himself as a Christian king, protecting his people's faith. To many, he embodied the first vision of an English nation, resilient, learned, and bound together by more than just blood or land. After Alfred's death, his successors pressed the fight. Under kings like Edward the Elder and Aethelstan, Wessex expanded its influence, and in 927 CE, Aethelstan became the first king to unite all England under one crown, though the unity was fragile, always under pressure from Viking resurgence. By the mid-10th century, the English crown had grown strong, but the Viking challenge returned with even greater force. Leaders like Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Nut the Great not only invaded but seized the English throne itself. For a generation, England was part of a North Sea empire that linked Denmark, Norway, and Britain under Nut's rule. His reign brought stability, and in many ways he governed as an English king as much as a Viking one, respecting local laws and the church. Yet his dynasty proved short-lived, and after his death, the English throne reverted to native rulers. The Anglo-Saxon age was nearing its climax. The kingdom had survived conquest, forged unity, and developed a culture that blended Germanic, Celtic, and Norse influences. But in 1066, a new storm would sweep across the Channel, one that would forever change England's destiny. The tale of the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings is not merely one of battles and raids. It is the story of how England itself was born. Their struggles forged an identity that valued law, faith, and kingship, while their mingling with the Norse left behind words, traditions, and bloodlines that endure even today. The land of the Angles had become a kingdom, but the kingdom was about to face its greatest trial, the Norman conquest. The year 1066 stands like a thunderclap in English history. Few dates are remembered with such clarity, for it marks not just a battle, but a transformation. The Anglo-Saxon world, with its wooden halls, its Old English tongue, and its tribal loyalties, was about to be reshaped under a new power, the Normans. The spark came with the death of Edward the Confessor, the childless King of England. His passing left the throne disputed. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, seized the crown, claiming Edward had promised it to him on his deathbed. But across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy, a formidable warrior with royal blood ties, declared that Edward had once promised him the throne and that Harold had even sworn an oath to support him. To William, Harold was a usurper. The clash was inevitable. In October of 1066, William landed with thousands of Norman knights and soldiers on the south coast of England. At Hastings, the two armies met. The battle raged for hours, Anglo-Saxon shield wall against Norman cavalry. But late in the day, Harold fell, according to legend, struck in the eye by an arrow, and his army collapsed. William, soon crowned William the Conqueror, had rewritten England's destiny. The Norman conquest was not simply a change of rulers, it was a revolution in the very structure of society. The Normans imposed a feudal system binding land to loyalty. William distributed vast estates to his Norman barons, replacing the Anglo-Saxon elite with a new ruling class of French-speaking lords. Castles of stone rose across the countryside, imposing fortresses like the Tower of London, symbols of Norman dominance and military strength. Language itself shifted. At court, in law, and in the church, Norman French became the tongue of power. Over time, Old English mingled with it, creating the foundation of the English language we speak today. Even words reveal the social divide. The Saxon peasant tended the cow, but the Norman lord dined on beef. The farmer raised the sheep, but the nobleman ate mutton. William also sought to understand and control his new kingdom with meticulous precision. In 1086, he commissioned the Domesday Book, a vast survey of lands, people, and resources. It was a record of extraordinary detail: who owned what, how many oxen, how many mills, how much land under the plough. To contemporaries, it seemed like the final judgment of God, unalterable and absolute, hence its ominous name. Yet the conquest was not without resistance. Rebellions flared, especially in the north, where William responded with brutal efficiency in the campaign known as the Harrying of the North, devastating entire regions. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was crushed, their influence permanently diminished. A new Anglo-Norman identity began to emerge, forged through both conquest and coexistence. Over the next century, the Norman dynasty consolidated its rule. Kings like William II and Henry I strengthened royal authority, while the church grew in influence, building towering cathedrals in the new Romanesque style. Monastic life flourished, producing chronicles and scholarship that shaped medieval thought. But the Normans were not just rulers of England, they were part of a greater European story. Norman knights carved out kingdoms in southern Italy, Sicily, and even the Holy Land during the Crusades. England itself became bound tightly to Normandy and the politics of France, entangling it in conflicts that would last for centuries. In 1154, with the death of King Stephen, a new dynasty took the throne, the Plantagenets, beginning with Henry II. His reign expanded England's dominions into a vast Angevin empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry reformed justice, laying the foundations of English common law. But his rule was not without turmoil. His stormy clashes with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, culminated in Becket's murder in 1170, shocking Christendom and leaving Henry to do penance. Henry's sons carried forward both his legacy and his troubles. Richard the Lionheart, famed for his role in the Crusades, spent little time in England, while his brother John became infamous for tyranny and failure. John A.'s defeat at the hands of the French and his oppressive taxation led to a moment of seismic importance in 1215. The barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was a document born of rebellion, but it enshrined principles that would echo through the ages. It asserted that the king was not above the law, that justice could not be sold or delayed, and that free men had rights the crown must respect. Though intended to resolve a temporary crisis, it became a cornerstone of constitutional government. The medieval centuries that followed were shaped by this balance of power between crown, church, and barons, alongside the struggles of ordinary people. England was racked by plagues, famines, and wars with France, yet also saw the flowering of culture, from the soaring Gothic cathedrals to the poetry of Chaucer. The Norman conquest had not only changed England, it had created medieval England, a land of feudal lords and castles, of Latin learning and vernacular verse, of kings who sought to be rulers of both England and continental Europe. The seeds of law, language, and governance planted in this era would shape not only Britain's destiny, but that of the wider world. From the fields of Hastings to the parchment of Magna Carta, the Norman and Plantagenet age forged the medieval heart of the kingdom. Yet greater trials awaited. The crown's ambitions in France, the horrors of the Black Death, and the wars that tore the realm apart would test the very survival of England's monarchy. By the 14th century, England was a kingdom both ambitious and vulnerable. The Normans had bound it to the politics of France, the Plantagenets had built a vast empire, and the Magna Carta had reshaped the balance between king and nobles. But now, the kingdom was about to face nearly 2 centuries of war, plague, and civil conflict that would test the very survival of its monarchy. The 100 Years' War begins. The spark for conflict came in 1337 when King Edward III of England claimed the French crown through his mother's lineage. To the French, this was intolerable. To the English, it was a chance to assert dominance across the Channel. Thus began the 100 Years' War, a conflict not continuous but spanning more than a century, with battles, truces, and shifting fortunes. In the early campaigns, England struck with astonishing victories. At Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, English longbowmen devastated French knights, shattering the old ideals of chivalric warfare. The longbow, drawn by peasants with deadly precision, became the weapon that humbled mounted nobility. Captains like the Black Prince, Edward's son, carved their names into legend. For a time, it seemed England might conquer France itself. But war is never simple. While soldiers battled abroad, death stalked England at home in a far more terrifying form. The Black Death. In 1348, a pestilence arrived on English shores, the Black Death, a plague carried by fleas on rats sweeping across Europe. Its impact was cataclysmic. Entire villages were wiped out, fields lay untended, and corpses filled the churchyards. Historians estimate that between a third and half of England's population perished in just a few years. The social order shuddered. With labour scarce, surviving peasants demanded better wages and more freedom. The old feudal bonds began to crack. Landowners, desperate for workers, could no longer enforce serfdom as before. Out of this disaster, the seeds of change were sown, the rise of a freer peasantry and the slow decline of medieval feudalism. The Crown, however, struggled to adapt. Attempts to freeze wages and tie workers to the land only fueled resentment. In 1381, this tension erupted in the Peasants' Revolt, when thousands marched on London under leaders like Wat Tyler. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair rents, and justice. King Richard II, only 14 years old, met them with promises, but when Tyler was killed in a scuffle, the revolt collapsed. The promises were broken, yet the message was clear: the people could no longer be ignored. Shifting fortunes of war. Meanwhile, the war with France continued. At first, the English held vast territories, but fortunes shifted. The French rallied under leaders like Joan of Arc, whose faith and defiance inspired her countrymen. By the mid-15th century, England's continental empire had shrunk dramatically, leaving only Calais. What had begun as a war of conquest ended in humiliation, draining England's treasury and morale. Yet the war left behind powerful legacies. It fostered a sense of national identity. English, once the language of peasants, replaced French at court and in law. Parliament grew in stature as kings relied on it for war funds. And the longbow, once a weapon of peasants, had shown that common men could decide the fate of nations. The Wars of the Roses. But if the French war weakened England abroad, worse awaited at home. The Plantagenet dynasty splintered, torn by rival claims between the houses of Lancaster, Red Rose, and York, White Rose. The conflict began in 1455 with the Battle of St. Albans, and for 3 decades England bled. Kings were crowned and deposed in rapid succession. Henry VI of Lancaster, gentle and pious but plagued by bouts of mental illness, faced the ambitious claims of Richard, Duke of York. Armies of noblemen raised private forces, and England descended into civil war. The battles were brutal. At Towton, 1461, one of the bloodiest fought on English soil, tens of thousands perished. Henry VI was captured, released, and captured again. The Yorkist leader, Edward IV, seized the throne, only for rebellion to flare repeatedly. For a time, even Warwick, the kingmaker, once Edward's ally, switched sides to restore Henry. In the end, Lancaster's cause faltered. Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he was murdered in 1471. Edward IV reigned securely, but upon his death, the wars reignited. His brother, Richard III, seized the crown from Edward's young sons, the princes in the Tower, whose mysterious disappearance remains one of history's most haunting crimes. Richard's reign was short and turbulent. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he was defeated by Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant. Richard was killed, the last English king to die in battle, and Henry was crowned Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses were over, but the scars of civil war remained deep. The legacy of turmoil, the century from the start of the 100 Years. War to Bosworth was one of devastation and transformation. War abroad, plague at home, and dynastic bloodshed reshaped England's society and monarchy. The Black Death weakened feudalism and gave rise to a freer, more mobile population. The Peasants' Revolt foreshadowed future struggles between rulers and the governed. The 100 Years' War fostered a sense of English identity, even as it ended in defeat. The Wars of the Roses showed the perils of weak kingship and the violence of aristocratic ambition. Yet out of this chaos emerged the Tudors, a new dynasty that would bring stability and, in time, one of the most celebrated eras in British history. The medieval world of feudal lords and endless war was fading. Ahead lay the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the making of England as a modern state. The smoke of Bosworth Field cleared in 1485, and with it the Wars of the Roses ended. Standing victorious was Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII. His victory was more than just a triumph of arms. It marked the birth of the Tudor dynasty, a new line that would dominate the 16th century and transform England from a fractured medieval realm into an emerging modern power. Henry VII. Stability restored. Henry VII's first task was survival. The crown he claimed was fragile, his bloodline tenuous. Through careful marriages, alliances, and ruthless suppression of rivals, he cemented his authority. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses of Lancaster and York in the Tudor emblem. He strengthened royal finances, curbed the independence of the nobility, and built the foundations of a stable monarchy. Though not glamorous, his reign gave England something it had long lacked: peace. Henry VIII, power, splendor, and the break with Rome. His son Henry VIII would shatter that peace in spectacular fashion. Enthroned in 1509, Henry was young, vigorous, and ambitious. His court glittered with Renaissance pageantry, masks, tournaments, and music. But it was Henry's marriages and his thirst for a male heir that changed England forever. Married first to Catherine of Aragon, Henry sought an annulment when she failed to give him a surviving son. The Pope refused. Henry's solution was radical. He rejected papal authority and declared himself head of the Church of England. The English Reformation had begun. Through the Act of Supremacy, 1534, Henry severed ties with Rome, dissolved monasteries, and seized their wealth, redistributing it to loyal nobles. This was no quiet reform, but a revolution. Ancient abbeys crumbled, shrines were stripped, and the religious landscape of England was remade. While Henry remained doctrinally conservative in many ways, his actions permanently changed the relationship between crown, church, and people. Henry's 6 marriages became legendary: 2 divorced, 2 executed, 1 who died, and 1 who survived him. Yet, through this turmoil, he fathered 3 heirs: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each destined to rule. Edward VI and Mary first a kingdom in religious whirlwind. Upon Henry's death in 1547, his young son Edward VI inherited the throne. Only 9 years old, Edward's reign was directed by Protestant advisors. Under them, the English Church moved decisively toward Protestantism. Latin liturgy was replaced with the Book of Common Prayer, and icons and altars vanished from parish churches. But Edward's reign was short. He died at 15, leaving the succession contested. For a brief moment, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, but within 9 days she was overthrown by Edward's half-sister, Mary Tudor. Known to history as Bloody Mary, she was determined to restore Catholicism. She married Philip II of Spain, burned Protestant martyrs at the stake, and tried to reverse her father's break with Rome. Yet her efforts failed to win hearts and minds, and her death in 1558 ended Catholic restoration. Elizabeth I, the Golden Age. Then came Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her reign, lasting nearly half a century, became one of the most celebrated in English history. Elizabeth steered a middle course in religion, creating a Protestant church that retained some traditional forms, seeking to unite her people. This Elizabethan settlement gave the Church of England its enduring character, Protestant in doctrine, yet moderate in practice. But Elizabeth's greatness lay not only in religion. She presided over a flowering of culture, the age of Shakespeare, Marlowe and Spencer, when English drama and poetry reached dazzling heights. Explorers like Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, and merchants of the East India Company laid the first foundations of an overseas empire. Her reign was also defined by danger. The Catholic powers of Europe saw her as illegitimate, and conspiracies abounded. The greatest threat came in 1588, when Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada. England, under Elizabeth's leadership, with the aid of storms and nimble ships, repelled the mighty fleet. The victory was not just military, it was symbolic. Protestant England had defied Catholic Europe's greatest monarch, and Elizabeth emerged as a national heroine. Yet Elizabeth never married. Known as the Virgin Queen, she left no heir. In 1603, with her death, the Tudor dynasty ended, but by then England was transformed. It had survived religious upheaval, repelled invasion, and begun to plant the seeds of empire. The Tudor legacy. The Tudor century reshaped England profoundly. The monarchy grew stronger, commanding both church and state. The Reformation gave England its own national church, distinct from Rome. A new national identity emerged, tied to Protestantism, seafaring adventure, and cultural glory. England shifted from a medieval backwater to an assertive, outward-looking power. Yet challenges remained. Religious divisions had not disappeared, and the monarchy's growing power would soon collide with demands for liberty and parliament. Ahead lay the Stuart dynasty, civil wars, and the struggle for the very soul of Britain. The Tudors left a kingdom more united, more confident, and more ambitious than ever before. They gave England the foundation on which its future greatness would be built, but also the tensions that would one day tear it apart. When Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, the crown passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under a single monarch. This union of the crowns did not yet create a single kingdom, but it bound together two realms whose histories had long been separate and often hostile. James I and the early Stuarts. James was a learned man, fond of theology and the arts, but he also believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were accountable to none but him. This put him on a collision course with Parliament, which had grown in power during the Tudor century. Under James, religious tensions simmered. He authorized the King James Bible, 1611, a literary masterpiece that shaped English culture for centuries. But he faced discontent from both Catholics and Puritans. The most infamous Catholic plot came in 1605, when conspirators led by Guy Fawkes attempted to blow up Parliament and the King in the Gunpowder Plot. The scheme failed, but it deepened suspicion of Catholics for generations. Charles I and the road to war. When James died in 1625, his son Charles I inherited both the throne and his father's belief in royal authority. But Charles lacked James's political tact. His insistence on raising taxes without Parliament's consent, his unpopular marriage to a Catholic princess, and his support for high church Anglicanism alienated both nobles and commoners. By the 1630s, Charles ruled without Parliament altogether, funding his government through dubious means. His attempts to impose religious uniformity in Scotland sparked rebellion, and when he sought money to crush it, Parliament resisted. Tensions spiraled until, in 1642, England erupted into civil war. The English Civil War. The war divided families and communities. On one side stood the Royalists, or Cavaliers, loyal to the king. On the other stood the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads, determined to check royal power. At first, the conflict seemed evenly matched, but under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, Parliament forged the new model army, disciplined, meritocratic, and driven by Puritan zeal. In battles such as Marston Moor, 1644, and Naseby, 1645, they crushed the king's forces. Captured and put on trial, Charles I was charged with treason against his own people. In a shocking, unprecedented act, he was executed in January 1649. For the first time, an English king had been beheaded by his subjects. The monarchy was abolished, and England declared a commonwealth. The interregnum, Cromwell's rule. Power now rested with Parliament, but divisions quickly emerged. Cromwell, the brilliant general, rose to dominate politics. As Lord Protector, he ruled in effect as a military dictator. He suppressed royalist uprisings, crushed Irish resistance with brutal campaigns, and sought to enforce Puritan morality, closing theatres, banning festivities, and imposing strict religious codes. Abroad, Cromwell strengthened England's navy and challenged the Dutch and Spanish, expanding trade and laying foundations for imperial ambition. Yet his stern rule alienated many, and when he died in 1658, the Commonwealth faltered. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, son of the executed king. The Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, brought back theatre, music, and courtly extravagance. His reign, however, was not free of turmoil. The Great Plague, 1665, and the Great Fire of London, 1666, devastated the capital, while ongoing wars with the Dutch tested England's resilience. Religious conflict endured. Parliament resisted Charles's attempts at toleration for Catholics and dissenters. The suspicion only deepened under his brother and successor James II, who openly embraced Catholicism and sought to expand royal power. By 1688, England faced the prospect of a Catholic dynasty, something deeply feared in a Protestant nation. The solution came in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament invited William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to take the throne. James fled, and William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs, not by divine right, but by parliamentary invitation. This moment was revolutionary. In 1689, the Bill of Rights codified limits on royal power. The monarch could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or raise armies without Parliament's consent. It guaranteed regular parliaments, free elections, and rights of petition. England had become a constitutional monarchy where sovereignty was shared and Parliament held the decisive role. The birth of parliamentary power. The Stuart century left Britain permanently changed. The struggle between Crown and Parliament had torn the kingdom apart, toppled kings and created dictatorships, but it ended with a balance of power that would endure. The execution of Charles I showed that no monarch stood above the law. The Commonwealth and Protectorate experimented, however imperfectly, with republican government. The Glorious Revolution established parliamentary supremacy, embedding liberties that influenced democratic movements worldwide. At the same time, Britain's horizons were widening. The seeds of empire planted under Elizabeth were growing. Trade companies, colonies in the Americas, and naval power were expanding. The stage was set for Britain, not only to redefine its monarchy, but to rise as a global power. The Stuart age was one of turbulence, revolution, and bloodshed, but it also laid the foundations of modern British democracy. The crown would remain, but never again would it wield unchecked power. Ahead lay the union of kingdoms, the rise of empire, and the dawn of the modern world. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had ensured that England's monarchy would forever be limited by Parliament. Yet even as the Crown's power was curbed, the kingdom itself was poised to grow larger and the empire wider. The late 17th and early 18th centuries marked the birth of the United Kingdom as a political reality and the emergence of Britain as a true world power. The union of England and Scotland. Since 1603, England and Scotland had shared a monarch, but they remained separate states, with different parliaments and laws. Tensions often simmered between the two nations, especially in matters of trade and religion. The turning point came in 1707 with the Act of Union. This act merged the English and Scottish parliaments into a single Parliament of Great Britain seated at Westminster. The union was not universally popular. Many Scots saw it as a loss of independence, while many Englishmen feared being dragged into Scottish troubles. Yet the agreement offered practical benefits. Scotland gained access to English colonial markets, while England secured its northern border. Together the kingdoms formed a more stable and formidable power. In 1714 the throne passed to a new dynasty, the Hanoverians, a German family with only distant ties to the English crown. The last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, had died without surviving heirs, and by the rules of succession, the crown went to George III of Hanover. He spoke little English and preferred his German homeland, but his reign marked a crucial shift. With a foreign king less involved in daily politics, Parliament and the office of Prime Minister grew in importance. The Hanoverians and the rise of parliamentary government. The early Hanoverian kings, George V and his son, George II, were often viewed as aloof, but their reigns coincided with the rise of modern parliamentary politics. Figures like Robert Walpole, often considered the first prime minister, exercised real executive power, steering policy and managing parliament. This shift further cemented the principle that while the king reigned, government was increasingly conducted through elected representatives. The balance between monarchy and parliament that had been struck in the 17th century was now tilting decisively toward parliamentary supremacy. Yet, while domestic politics evolved, Britain's gaze was increasingly outward. Trade, colonies and naval power were pulling the kingdom onto the global stage. Empire and war abroad. The 18th century was an age of almost constant war. Britain and France, long rivals, clashed repeatedly for global dominance. In the War of Spanish Succession 1701-1714, Britain gained key territories including Gibraltar, securing naval control of the Mediterranean. But the greatest rivalry unfolded in North America and India. During the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, Britain achieved stunning victories. Under commanders like James Wolfe, British forces captured Quebec, securing Canada from France. In India, the East India Company, led by men like Robert Clive, defeated French and local rivals, laying the foundation for British dominion over the subcontinent. By the war's end, Britain had become the world's leading colonial power. Its navy ruled the seas, its colonies stretched across the Americas, Africa and Asia, and its merchants grew wealthy from global trade. Yet empire was a double-edged sword. With far-flung possessions came new responsibilities and new conflicts. The American Revolution. One of the greatest blows to Britain's empire came not long after its greatest triumph. In the 13 colonies of North America, resentment grew over taxation without representation and restrictions on trade. What began with protests like the Boston Tea Party escalated into the American Revolutionary War in 1775-1783. Under George III, Britain fought to maintain control, but despite its military might, it could not suppress the determination of the colonists, especially with aid from France and Spain. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States of America. The loss of the American colonies was a bitter humiliation. Critics attacked government corruption and inefficiency, while radicals called for reform at home. Yet in the long run, The defeat pushed Britain to consolidate and expand its empire elsewhere, especially in India and the Pacific. The industrial and social foundations of power. At the same time, changes were stirring at home. Britain's wealth increasingly rested on commerce and industry. Banking, trade, and early mechanization laid the groundwork for the coming industrial revolution. Cities grew, merchants flourished, and the middle class began to demand greater political influence. But this prosperity had dark shadows. Much of it was built on the Atlantic slave trade, in which British ships transported enslaved Africans to the Americas. The profits of slavery enriched merchants and funded industry, but the human cost was horrific. Opposition grew, and in the late 18th century, abolitionists like William Wilberforce began their campaign to end the trade. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Britain faced another epical challenge, the French Revolution. The overthrow of monarchy in France and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte threatened the established order of Europe. Britain became Napoleon's most determined foe. The Royal Navy, under Admiral Nelson, won a decisive victory at Trafalgar, 1805, securing Britain's command of the seas. On land, the Duke of Wellington's army fought across Spain and finally defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, 1815. Victory in the Napoleonic Wars cemented Britain's status as the world's foremost power. Its empire expanded, its navy unmatched, its industry surging. The small island kingdom had risen to global preeminence, the legacy of Union and Hanoverian Britain. The 18th century and the early Hanoverian age left behind profound legacies. The Act of Union, 1707, created the political framework of Britain as a united state. The Hanoverians oversaw the decline of royal power and the rise of parliamentary government. Britain's naval supremacy and colonial expansion established it as a global empire. The loss of America was balanced by growth in India and elsewhere. The seeds of the Industrial Revolution were planted, which would soon transform society. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain was not just a kingdom, it was becoming the British Empire, a global superpower. But the very forces that made it strong, industry, empire, and social change, would also generate new tensions at home and abroad. The next century would test whether Britain could remain united and dominant in a world of revolution and transformation. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain stood at a unique crossroads. Victorious over Napoleon, supreme at sea, and expanding across the globe, it now experienced a revolution not of kings or parliaments, but of machines, factories, and steam. This was the Industrial Revolution, a transformation that would turn Britain into the workshop of the world and set the stage for the Victorian Age, an era of empire, industry, and reform. The Industrial Revolution. The roots of Britain's industrial power lay in its resources and innovations. Rich deposits of coal and iron, a network of rivers and ports, and an entrepreneurial spirit combined to spark unprecedented change. Inventions such as James Watt's steam engine, Richard Arkwright's spinning frame, and George Stephenson's railway locomotive revolutionized production and transport. Textiles poured from mechanized mills, ironworks forged rails and bridges, and coal-powered engines drove pumps, factories, and ships. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool boomed, swelling with workers who left rural villages for urban factories. The skyline filled with chimneys, the air with smoke. Britain became the first truly industrial society, rich, powerful, and restless. But industrialization brought hardship as well as progress. Children worked long hours in mills and mines. Families crowded into slums with little sanitation. Diseases like cholera spread rapidly. Amid prosperity, poverty festered. The contrast between wealth and misery defined much of the age. Political reform and social change. The new industrial middle class demanded political influence, challenging a system still dominated by landed aristocrats. Reformers pushed for change, and in 1832 the Reform Act widened the franchise, giving representation to growing cities and reducing rotten boroughs. Further reforms in 1867 and 1884 extended the vote to more men, though women would still wait until the 20th century. Social reform also gained ground. Campaigners fought against child labor, unsafe conditions, and the slave trade. The abolitionist movement triumphed with the end of the slave trade in 1807 and the emancipation of enslaved people across the empire in 1833. Figures like William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp embodied the moral conscience of the age. Education expanded, charities flourished, and new movements such as Chartism demanded universal male suffrage and parliamentary reform. Though not immediately successful, Chartism left a lasting mark on democratic development. The Age of Victoria. In 1837, Queen Victoria ascended the throne, beginning a reign of more than 60 years. She became the symbol of a confident, expanding nation, so much so that her era gave its name to an age, the Victorian Age. Victoria presided over a monarchy that had lost much political power but gained immense cultural authority. With her husband, Prince Albert, she promoted science, education, and industry. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the Crystal Palace, showcased Britain's industrial might to the world. Machinery, inventions, and imperial goods all displayed in glittering splendor. But the age was not simply one of progress. It was also an era of moral strictness, class rigidity, and empire. Victorians prized discipline and respectability, yet beneath the surface lay anxieties about poverty, social unrest, and the moral costs of empire. The expansion of empire. The 19th century was the high watermark of the British Empire. After the loss of America, Britain consolidated India under the East India Company before taking direct control following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. India became the jewel in the crown, a vast colony supplying raw materials and serving as a market for British goods. Elsewhere, Britain expanded into Africa, the Pacific, and beyond. Colonies in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand developed into settler societies, while trade routes stretched across Asia and Africa. The empire was bound together by the Royal Navy, which ensured British control of the seas. But empire also brought conflict and controversy. In Ireland, famine in the 1840s exposed mismanagement and deepened resentment. In Africa and Asia, colonial rule was often harsh, marked by economic exploitation and cultural domination. The empire enriched Britain, but left a legacy of division and resistance, war and diplomacy. The Victorian era was also marked by wars abroad. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, saw Britain and France fight Russia, remembered for the charge of the Light Brigade and the pioneering nursing of Florence Nightingale. In Africa and Asia, Britain fought wars against Zulus, Boers, and Afghans. At the same time, Britain pursued a careful diplomacy in Europe, often acting as a balancer of power. The Navy ensured global dominance, and free trade policies encouraged worldwide commerce. By mid-century, Britain was the richest and most powerful nation on earth. Science, culture, and identity. The Victorian age was also one of intellectual and cultural ferment. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, challenged religious understandings of creation. Writers like Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters explored social injustice, morality, and human complexity. Engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel built railways, bridges, and steamships that transformed the landscape. The Victorians were fascinated by progress, but they also wrestled with doubt. Religion, science, and empire created tensions that shaped identity. Britain was a nation of invention and industry, but also of poverty and empire, proud, self-confident, and uneasy all at once. The legacy of the Victorian age. The Industrial Revolution and the Victorian Empire transformed Britain and the world. Industry created unprecedented wealth and reshaped society, but also exposed harsh inequalities. Political reforms broadened democracy, though struggles for suffrage and equality continued. The monarchy under Victoria became a unifying symbol of stability and morality. The empire expanded to its greatest extent, linking Britain to every continent. Science, culture, and literature flourished, redefining how Britons saw themselves and their place in the world. By the end of Victoria's reign in 1901, Britain was the preeminent global power. Its navy ruled the seas, its empire spanned a quarter of the globe, and its industries set the pace of modern life. Yet beneath this grandeur lay vulnerabilities. Other powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, were rising. Class conflict, suffrage movements, and colonial discontent stirred. The Victorian confidence would not last forever. The next century would bring wars on a scale never seen before, wars that would shake Britain's empire and its very place in the world. The dawn of the 20th century found Britain at its zenith. The empire stretched across a quarter of the globe, its navy unmatched, its industries dominant. Queen Victoria's death in 1901 ushered in the reign of her son, Edward VII, and the era that followed seemed full of promise. Yet beneath the grandeur lay fault lines, industrial unrest, calls for Irish independence, and the rise of rival powers. Within 2 decades, Britain would be plunged into a conflict unlike any it had ever faced. The First World War, 1914-1918. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered a chain of alliances that drew Europe into war. Britain, honoring its commitments and fearing German domination of the continent, declared war on Germany. The war was unlike anything before. Millions of men marched to the Western Front, where trench warfare turned France and Belgium into landscapes of mud, barbed wire, and death. Battles such as the Somme, 1916, and Passchendaele, 1917, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The machine gun, artillery, and poison gas brought industrialized slaughter. Britain mobilized its empire. Troops from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa fought and died alongside British soldiers. At sea, the Royal Navy blockaded Germany, while the Battle of Jutland, 1916, tested naval supremacy. On the home front, women entered factories, driving buses and producing munitions. Rationing, air raids, and the first mass mobilization of society reshaped daily life. Out of necessity, women won the vote, at least partially, in 1918. Victory came at immense cost. Nearly 1 million British soldiers were dead and millions more wounded. The empire survived, but the war left scars, economic strain, grief, and disillusionment. The war to end all wars had only set the stage for an even greater catastrophe. The interwar years. The 1920s and 1930s were years of upheaval. The empire expanded on paper. Britain gained mandates in the Middle East, but its hold weakened elsewhere. In Ireland, after years of struggle, independence was won in 1921, creating the Irish Free State, while Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. At home, economic hardship bred unrest. The general strike of 1926 symbolized deep divisions between labor and government. Internationally, the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy threatened peace, while the League of Nations, intended to prevent future wars, proved ineffective. The Second World War, 1939-1945. In 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, Britain once again declared war. This time, the struggle would be total and existential. The early years brought disaster. France fell in 1940, leaving Britain to stand alone against Hitler. In the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force fought off the Luftwaffe, preventing invasion. Nightly bombings, known as the Blitz, devastated London, Coventry, and other cities, but the population endured with determination. Leadership was crucial. Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, rallied the nation with words that became legendary. "Britain would fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." His defiance symbolized the island's resistance. The war stretched across the globe. In North Africa, at El Alamein, British forces turned back the Germans. In Asia, Britain fought bitterly against Japan, suffering the humiliation of losing Singapore in 1942, but later reclaiming ground in Burma. Allied with the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain helped plan the D-Day invasion of Normandy, 1944, which began the liberation of Europe. By the 1945, victory was won, but it came at immense cost, hundreds of thousands dead, cities shattered, and the economy drained. Though Britain stood among the victors, it emerged weakened, overshadowed by the new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The decline of empire. The Second World War marked a turning point not just for Britain, but for its empire. The war had exposed the fragility of imperial control and inspired independence movements across the globe. In India, long the jewel in the crown, nationalist leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru pressed for freedom. In 1947, Britain granted independence, partitioning the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. This moment was both triumph and tragedy, as partition unleashed violence and mass migrations. Elsewhere, the tide of decolonization surged. Nations in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia gradually won independence in the decades that followed. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain's attempt to control the Suez Canal collapsed under US and Soviet pressure, confirmed that Britain was no longer the world's foremost power. Rebuilding and the welfare state. At home, the war years had reshaped society. The shared struggle fostered demands for a fairer system. In 1942, the Beveridge Report proposed sweeping reforms targeting 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. After the war, the Labour government of Clement Attlee created the welfare state, the National Health Service (NHS), expanded education, nationalised industries, and broadened social security. This post-war settlement defined British life for a generation. It reflected both the exhaustion of empire and the desire to build a just society at home. Legacy of the World Wars. The 2 world wars transformed Britain utterly. The First World War shattered old certainties, weakened the aristocracy, and broadened democracy. The Second World War preserved Britain's independence, but confirmed the end of its global dominance. The empire, once vast and confident, now entered a long retreat. At home, society shifted toward equality, welfare, and reconstruction. From the carnage of war, Britain emerged smaller in power but determined to reinvent itself. Ahead lay the Cold War, the struggles of decolonization, and the challenge of defining its role in a world now led by others. The guns of 1945 fell silent, but Britain's struggle was far from over. Victorious yet exhausted, the nation faced a new reality. It was no longer the world's dominant empire, and the global order was now shaped by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain's task was to adapt, to rebuild at home, and to find a new role abroad in a rapidly changing world. The age of austerity and the welfare state. The immediate post-war years were marked by hardship. Cities lay in ruins, rationing continued well into the 1950s, and the economy staggered under debt. Yet out of the ashes came one of the most profound transformations in British society, the creation of the welfare state. Under Clement Attlee's Labour government, sweeping reforms reshaped life. The National Health Service, 1948, provided free healthcare to all, a radical break from the past. Industries like coal, steel, and railways were nationalized to stabilize the economy. Education was expanded, housing projects built, and a safety net established for the poor. This new settlement reflected the lessons of war. The sacrifices of millions demanded a fairer society. Despite economic struggles, the welfare state became a cornerstone of modern Britain, cherished by generations. The end of empire. Even as Britain rebuilt at home, its empire unraveled abroad. Independence in India in 1947 had set the tone, and throughout the 1950s and 1960s, colonies across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia gained freedom. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Jamaica, and many others left colonial rule behind. The empire's retreat was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Malayan emergency, and the bloody partition of India revealed the costs of decolonization. But Britain, recognizing its diminished power, often managed transitions through negotiation, creating the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies and dominions. The humiliating Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized the shift in global power. When Britain, alongside France and Israel, invaded Egypt to seize control of the Suez Canal, international outrage forced a withdrawal under US and Soviet pressure. The episode confirmed that Britain was no longer the world's policeman. Its imperial age was ending, the Cold War, and a new role. In the new bipolar world, Britain aligned firmly with the United States and NATO against the Soviet Union. The Cold War defined foreign policy as Britain maintained military bases abroad, built nuclear weapons, and stationed forces in Germany. Britain fought smaller wars on the edges of empire and beyond. In 1950, British troops joined the United Nations in the Korean War. In 1982, under Margaret Thatcher, Britain fought the Falklands War, retaking the South Atlantic islands from Argentine occupation. Though a minor conflict on the global scale, the Falklands victory became a defining moment of national pride. The nuclear age also brought dilemmas. Britain tested its own nuclear weapons, insisting on retaining great power status. Yet dependence on American technology made clear that Britain's role was increasingly that of junior partner to the United States. Social change and cultural revolutions. At home, the post-war decades were a time of dramatic social transformation. The arrival of immigrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa reshaped Britain's identity. The Windrush generation, beginning in 1948, brought thousands of Caribbean workers to help rebuild the economy, laying the foundations of a multicultural society. But immigration also provoked tensions. Racism, housing discrimination, and inequality sparked protests and riots in places like Notting Hill, 1958. Over time, however, new communities enriched Britain's culture, cuisine, and politics. The 1960s saw a cultural explosion. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other icons of British music conquered the world. London became the heart of global fashion and style, the swinging 60s. Social reforms legalized abortion and homosexuality, abolished capital punishment, and expanded education. A spirit of youth, liberation, and modernity transformed British society. Yet economic troubles soon followed. The 1970s were marked by inflation, oil crises, and strikes. The winter of discontent of 1978-79 symbolized Britain's decline. Rubbish piled in the streets, unions paralyzed industry, and confidence faltered. Thatcherism and the Conservative Revolution. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first female Prime Minister. Her government launched a sweeping transformation of the economy and society. She championed free markets, privatization of state industries, and curbs on trade union power. Her tough stance earned her the nickname the Iron Lady. Thatcher's policies were divisive. Supporters credited her with revitalizing Britain's stagnant economy, reducing inflation, and reasserting global confidence. Critics accused her of deepening inequality, destroying communities dependent on heavy industry, and weakening the social fabric. Her government faced violent clashes with unions, particularly in the miners' strike of 1984-85, a bitter confrontation that left scars in working-class communities for decades. Yet her leadership during the Falklands War boosted her popularity, and she won 3 successive elections, reshaping British politics for a generation. The end of the Cold War. The late 1980s brought profound change. The collapse of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. For Britain, the end of the East-West divide raised new questions. What role should it play in the post-Cold War world? At home, Thatcher's premiership ended in 1990, succeeded by John Major, who sought a more moderate course. Meanwhile, debates over Europe intensified. Britain had joined the European Economic Community in 1973, but divisions over sovereignty, integration, and the euro would haunt politics for decades to come. Legacy of post-war Britain. From 1945 to 1990, Britain was transformed. The welfare state redefined citizenship and social rights. The empire dissolved, replaced by a commonwealth of independent nations. The Cold War alliance tied Britain to America, preserving influence but limiting independence. Social change created a more diverse, modern society, though often marked by tension. The economy shifted from industry to services, reshaping class and community life. By the close of the Cold War, Britain was no longer an empire, but neither was it a fading relic. It had reinvented itself as a European power, a transatlantic ally, and a multicultural society. Ahead lay new challenges: globalization, terrorism, and the divisive question of Britain's relationship with Europe itself. As the 20th century drew to a close, Britain stood at yet another crossroads. The Cold War was over, the empire long gone, and the welfare state firmly established. Yet the nation faced questions about its identity, its role in the world, and the very unity of its kingdom. The decades to come would bring triumphs and crises that reshaped Britain for the 21st century. The New Labour era. In 1997, after nearly 2 decades of Conservative rule, the Labour Party, led by Tony Blair, swept to power in a landslide victory. Blair's programme, dubbed New Labour, promised modernisation, economic growth, and social investment. The late 1990s and early 2000s were years of optimism. The economy grew, public services expanded, and Britain embraced a new image of confidence. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, brokered under Blair, brought a fragile but enduring peace to Northern Ireland, ending decades of sectarian conflict known as the Troubles. For this alone, Blair's government earned lasting recognition. Blair also pursued reforms in education, health and welfare, while promoting Britain as a global leader in technology and culture. London flourished as a financial hub, and the arts thrived. For a time, it seemed Britain had rediscovered its sense of purpose, yet Blair's premiership was overshadowed by foreign policy. After the September 11th attacks of 2001, Britain stood alongside the United States in the war on terror. Troops were sent to Afghanistan, and in 2003 Blair supported the US-led invasion of Iraq. The war proved deeply divisive. Many Britons opposed it, and as weapons of mass destruction failed to materialize, Blair's reputation was permanently tarnished. The global financial crisis and austerity. After Blair, Gordon Brown briefly served as Prime Minister, but his time in office was defined by the global financial crisis of 2008. British banks collapsed, requiring massive bailouts. Recession struck, unemployment rose, and government debt soared. In 2010, the Conservatives returned to power under David Cameron, leading a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. The government launched a policy of austerity, cutting public spending to reduce debt. Supporters argued it restored financial stability. Critics claimed it deepened inequality, weakened public services, and left scars on communities across the country. Brexit and the European question. Perhaps the most consequential decision of modern Britain came in 2016, when Cameron called a referendum on membership in the European Union. The vote was narrow but decisive. 52% chose to leave. The result stunned the world and plunged Britain into years of political turmoil. Brexit was more than a policy decision, it was a reflection of deep divisions. Many in rural areas, older generations and parts of England felt left behind by globalization and skeptical of EU influence. Others, especially in Scotland, London and younger demographics, voted to remain. The vote exposed fractures in British society: urban versus rural, old versus young, Scotland versus England. Cameron resigned, replaced by Theresa May, who struggled to negotiate an exit deal that could satisfy both Parliament and the public. After repeated failures, she stepped down in 2019, succeeded by Boris Johnson, who campaigned to get Brexit done. Under Johnson, Britain formally left the EU in January 2020, ending nearly half a century of membership. Brexit reshaped Britain's economy, politics and global standing. Trade relationships shifted, and questions of identity, who the British are and where they belong, lingered. The pandemic and modern crises. Just as Brexit was being finalized, the world was struck by the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020. Britain faced one of the highest death tolls in Europe. Lockdowns, economic shutdowns, and healthcare strain tested the nation. The NHS became both a frontline defense and a symbol of national solidarity. The pandemic also accelerated debates over inequality, work, and government competence. Controversies over lockdown breaches by officials, including Johnson himself, fueled public anger and eventually led to his resignation in 2022. Scotland, Wales, and the question of unity. Meanwhile, the unity of the kingdom itself came under strain. Scotland, which had narrowly voted against independence in 2014, grew increasingly restless after Brexit. The Scottish National Party, SNP, pressed for another referendum, arguing that Scotland had been forced out of the EU against its will. In Northern Ireland, Brexit complicated peace, raising questions about borders with the Republic of Ireland. The very concept of the United Kingdom, forged by union over centuries, faced renewed challenges in the 21st century. The monarchy in transition. Modern Britain also witnessed a transition in its monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned since 1952, remained a constant presence through decades of change. Her death in 2022, after 70 years on the throne, marked the end of an era. Her son ascended as King Charles III, inheriting not only the crown, but the task of guiding the monarchy in an age of skepticism and scrutiny. The monarchy's symbolic role endures, but debates over its future reflect Britain's ongoing struggle to balance tradition with modernity. Britain in the 21st century world today, Britain navigates a complex world. Outside the EU, it seeks a global Britain identity, forging new trade deals and alliances. Its relationship with the United States remains close, but questions linger about its true influence in a world dominated by American, Chinese, and European power blocs. Domestically, challenges abound: economic inequality, housing shortages, strained healthcare, and debates over immigration and identity. Britain remains a cultural powerhouse in music, literature, sport, and media. But its politics often seem fractured, its direction uncertain. Legacy of modern Britain, from New Labour to Brexit, from optimism to crisis, modern Britain has experienced sweeping transformation. The Good Friday Agreement brought peace to Northern Ireland, though fragile. The Iraq War and foreign entanglements left deep divisions. The financial crisis and austerity reshaped the economy and society. Brexit redefined Britain's relationship with Europe and its global role. The pandemic tested resilience and revealed fault lines. The death of Elizabeth II closed one of the longest chapters in British history. Britain today is no longer the empire it once was, nor the unquestioned world leader of past centuries. Yet, It remains influential, resilient, and searching for a new identity in the 21st century. The story is far from over. The United Kingdom of the 21st century stands as a nation forged by millennia of conquest, union, empire, and struggle. Its story has been one of remarkable resilience, but also of constant reinvention. Today, the UK is a mid-sized European power with global reach. Its influence no longer imperial, but still significant in diplomacy, culture, and ideas. Yet the challenges it faces are as complex as any in its long history. The legacy of Brexit Britain's departure from the European Union in 2020 remains one of the most consequential decisions in its modern history. Supporters hailed it as a restoration of sovereignty and the chance to chart an independent path in trade and law. Critics warned of economic disruption and political isolation. The reality has been mixed. Britain has signed new trade deals with nations like Australia and Japan, but frictions with the EU remain. Businesses face new barriers and questions linger about competitiveness. Politically, Brexit reshaped the party system, driving realignments in working class and middle class support. More profoundly, Brexit has raised questions of national identity. Scotland and Northern Ireland, both of which voted to remain in the EU, have felt increasingly distant from England's political choices. The decision not only redefined Britain's role abroad, but also strained its unity at home. The Union under pressure. The United Kingdom is, at its heart, a union of four nations: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Yet that union is under strain. In Scotland, the Scottish National Party, SNP, continues to press for another independence referendum. The 2014 vote, which kept Scotland in the UK, was settled partly on the argument that independence would mean leaving the EU. Brexit has overturned that logic. The question of whether Scotland will one day leave the Union remains unresolved. In Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement 1998 brought peace, but Brexit complicated the delicate balance between unionists and nationalists. The Northern Ireland Protocol, designed to avoid a hard border with the Republic of Ireland, effectively placed customs checks in the Irish Sea, angering many unionists. Political tensions flare, reminding the world that peace, though enduring, is never guaranteed. Wales, too, has seen growing calls for greater autonomy. While Welsh nationalism has not reached the level of Scotland's, devolution has given Wales and Scotland their own parliaments, making the UK less centralised than ever before. The challenge is clear. The very survival of the United Kingdom as a political entity is no longer taken for granted. The monarchy in a new era. The monarchy remains one of Britain's most enduring symbols, but it too faces the test of modernity. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 ended a reign that spanned 70 years, an era in which she became the embodiment of continuity and stability. Her successor, King Charles III, inherits both the crown and the challenge of maintaining its relevance in an age of skepticism. Support for the monarchy remains strong, but debates about its cost, privilege, and future are louder than before. The younger generations especially question whether monarchy has a place in a democratic society. Yet the monarchy also remains a powerful tool of soft power. Royal weddings, jubilees, and global visibility ensure that Britain retains a unique cultural influence, rooted in tradition, but contested in meaning. Britain in the global arena. Though no longer an empire, Britain continues to play an outsized role on the world stage. Its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, membership in the G7, and leadership in NATO give it influence in global diplomacy and defense. Britain has been a strong supporter of Ukraine during the Russian invasion of 2022, providing weapons, aid, and training. It continues to maintain close ties with the United States, the so-called special relationship, while also seeking to deepen connections with the Indo-Pacific region in an era of rising Chinese power. At the same time, Britain balances its heritage as a European nation with its decision to leave the EU. The challenge is to remain relevant in a multipolar world where economic and military power is shifting toward Asia. Domestic challenges. At home, Britain faces profound social and economic questions. The National Health Service, NHS, once the pride of the welfare state, struggles under pressure from funding shortages, aging populations, and rising demand. Housing shortages, inequality, and regional divides create tensions between prosperous London and the struggling former industrial regions. Immigration remains a hotly debated issue, shaping elections and fueling populist movements. Britain's identity as a multicultural society is both celebrated and contested as questions of integration, diversity, and belonging dominate political discourse. Climate change also demands attention. Britain has taken ambitious steps toward renewable energy, becoming a leader in offshore wind power. Yet balancing environmental goals with economic realities remains a challenge. Culture and global influence. If Britain is no longer an empire, its culture still circles the globe. From Shakespeare to the Beatles, Harry Potter to Premier League football, British culture remains one of its greatest exports. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge attract students worldwide, while London endures as a financial, artistic, and political hub. Britain's soft power is immense. The English language itself, rooted in the Anglo-Saxon past, enriched by Norman French, globalized through empire, has become the lingua franca of the modern world. Few nations of Britain's size wield such enduring cultural influence. The road ahead. The United Kingdom today is a nation at a crossroads. Globally, it seeks a role outside the EU while navigating an uncertain multipolar world. Domestically, it faces pressures on its union, its monarchy, and its welfare state. Socially, it continues to negotiate questions of identity, belonging, and diversity. Economically, it grapples with the legacies of austerity, Brexit, and the pandemic. Yet history suggests that Britain's greatest strength has always been its capacity to adapt. From Roman province to medieval kingdom, from empire to modern democracy, it has repeatedly reinvented itself. The 21st century will demand no less. Legacy of the contemporary UK. The story of the United Kingdom in the modern world is not one of decline alone. It is the story of a nation that, despite diminished power, continues to shape global politics, culture, and thought. Its challenges are immense, but so too is its resilience. As Britain moves forward, it carries with it the legacies of Celts and Romans, Saxons and Normans, Tudors and Victorians, soldiers of world wars and builders of peace. The story is not finished. The islands that once ruled an empire now face the challenge of ruling themselves wisely in a complex, interconnected world. From mist-shrouded prehistory to the turbulence of today, the history of the United Kingdom is the story of how a small group of islands at Europe's edge shaped the world. It begins with the ancient Celts and Romans, who laid the earliest cultural and structural foundations. The Celts gave myth and identity, the Romans law and order. With Rome's fall, the Anglo-Saxons built kingdoms, only to be challenged by the Vikings, whose raids forged resilience and unity under leaders like Alfred the Great. The Norman conquest of 1066 transformed England, replacing its ruling class, reshaping language, and embedding feudalism. Out of this emerged medieval England, cathedrals, common law, and Magna Carta, seeds of constitutional liberty. Yet the Middle Ages also brought devastation, the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the dynastic carnage of the Wars of the Roses. The Tudors restored stability and launched England into modernity. Henry VIII's break with Rome created the Church of England, while Elizabeth I's reign saw cultural flowering and naval triumph over Spain. With the Stuarts, the struggle between Crown and Parliament exploded into civil war, regicide, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which enshrined parliamentary supremacy. The Act of Union 1707 bound England and Scotland into Great Britain, while the Hanoverians presided over the rise of parliamentary government. Overseas, empire grew through war and trade, reaching unprecedented heights after victories in the 7 Years' War. The loss of America was a blow, but Britain turned toward India, Africa, and the Pacific. The Industrial Revolution made Britain the world's first industrial nation. Under Queen Victoria, the empire expanded to cover a quarter of the globe, while science, literature, and reform flourished. Yet, this golden age was shadowed by inequality and colonial exploitation. The World Wars brought Britain to the brink. In the First World War, its people endured slaughter. In the Second, they stood alone against Nazi tyranny before emerging victorious but exhausted. The wars confirmed the decline of empire. India, Africa, and others moved toward independence, leaving Britain to redefine its role in a world dominated by America and the Soviet Union. The post-war years saw the creation of the welfare state, decolonization, and the Cold War alliance with the United States. Social revolutions in the 1960s reshaped culture, while economic struggles in the 1970s gave way to Thatcher's free market revolution. The end of the Cold War left Britain still influential but searching for purpose. In the 21st century, New Labour brought optimism and peace in Northern Ireland, but the wars in Iraq, the financial crisis, and austerity reshaped politics. Brexit divided the nation and redefined its global role. The death of Elizabeth II in 2022 closed an era of continuity, leaving King Charles III to lead a monarchy under scrutiny. And so the UK today faces questions of unity, identity, and influence. Scotland and Northern Ireland test the bonds of union. Immigration and inequality challenge society. Its global role, once imperial, now depends on diplomacy, culture, and alliances. Yet through every upheaval, conquest, plague, war, and change, the United Kingdom has endured. Its language, its culture, its ideas of law, liberty, and governance continue to shape the modern world. Its story is one of survival and reinvention, a reminder that even on storm-swept islands, history can echo across the globe.